it still says off air. Okay, there we go. Hello, we are Central Group 2. My name is Monique Beimer, and also with us tonight is Ashley Bloodworth, Gina Bolin, Kyla Davis, Jacqueline Hildebrand, and Stephanie Pilsner. The following is our replication presentation for increasing physical activity. The study we decided to replicate, increasing physical activity of young adults with autism spectrum disorders, was originally performed by Kate Lalonde, Brian McNeil, Laura Wolf-Eversole, Stephen Rogotsky, and Alan Poling in 2014. The original study, performed in 2014, included 4 students, 3 male and 1 female, diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Physical exercise is an important aspect of life. However, research indicates that the majority of individuals on the spectrum do not exercise regularly. The study aims to assess if there is a functional relationship between goal setting and reinforcement on the number of steps taken per day during the student's school day. Both of the original study and our replication used a multiple baseline across participants to design to determine if goal setting and reinforcement had any effect on the number of steps taken during a 6-hour period. The original study was from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., and for our replication, we measured steps during the first 6 hours of the day. Each participant measured her steps using a pedometer, smartwatch, or smartphone app and shared these numbers with the rest of the group members using a shared Excel-like Google Doc sheet.
Many studies have been conducted on increasing physical activity in children and adults by measuring steps taken using a pedometer or other step tracking devices, such as a measurement system. It's estimated that 66% of adults are overweight in the US and 33% are obese. Approximately 32% of children are considered to be overweight or obese. Being overweight or obese can lead to health problems such as diabetes, heart disease, or breathing problems. Increasing physical activity can reduce weight gain and the associated effects on health. The most common methods of assessment for reporting physical activity as a dependent measure in research are mechanical devices that sense motion or physiological changes and direct behavioral observation. Mechanical devices include pedometers, Fitbits, and heart rate monitors. Pedometers, which are worn at the hip, are considered the most accurate device and were used in most studies to track the number of steps taken by participants. The new Lifestyles 2000 pedometer is recommended for research use because of its accuracy and reliability. It can be calibrated for height, weight, gender, and age. Participants and settings vary among studies. Studies include children and adults, both in good health or with health conditions, average size to obese, and typical developing to individuals with disabilities. Settings include specific environments during specific times to natural environments without restrictions. Inter-observer agreement was measured differently across studies. Some studies measured agreement by calculating the total number of steps, with an agreement being the same number of steps recorded by both observers. In the study conducted by Hayes and Van Camp, participants wore Fitbits to track their steps. Reliability data was collected by having at least one participant wear a second Fitbit each session. Agreement was then calculated by dividing the smallest step total by the largest step total, then multiplying by 100 to calculate a percentage. The agreement average was 95% when using the 2 Fitbits. Baseline data is usually obtained at the start of most studies, and intervention begins once data is stable. During baseline for tracking the number of steps taken, many studies covered the screen of the pedometer so the participants could not monitor their steps. Observers collected the pedometers at the end of the baseline and recorded the data. Participants were not given performance goals and did not receive consequences or feedback during baseline. Once baseline was established or didn't present an upward trend, intervention was introduced. During the intervention, the pedometers were uncovered so participants could view them. In many studies, goals were set based on the average number of steps taken during baseline. Most studies use contingency management or self-management interventions. Contingent management involves someone who monitors someone else's progress and delivers reinforcers, whereas self-management involves someone recording their own data. Both methods are successful in increasing steps of adults. Reinforcers were typically provided during the intervention phases when goals were met. Some studies conducted social validity surveys at the conclusion of the studies using a rating scale. These surveys assessed whether participants believed the different components of the intervention were useful and their overall satisfaction with the study. A limitation in some of the studies was the cost of the measurement devices. A simple pedometer may be $10 to $15, but a more high-tech device such as a Fitbit may be hundreds of dollars. Another limitation was the loss of participants. Participants either moved away or dropped out. Losing data due to technology was one other concern. The Hayes and Van Camp study lost data to syncing failure. The overall results of the study demonstrated effective interventions for increasing steps. Studies demonstrated an increase in the number of steps taken during intervention with a decrease in the number of steps when intervention was withdrawn. Overall, most participants took more steps during intervention than during baseline.
The method section, participants in the study included 6 females, ranging from ages 25 to 40. All participants were master level students at Ball State University and enrolled in SPCE 611. Each participant signed up for a group at random based on time zones. Participants are located in different areas in the United States in the Central Time Zone, except one participant who is located in Pacific Time Zone. Settings of the study included anywhere that the participants went for the first 6 hours of being awake. Settings in the studies included being at home, work, going to a running trail, and community settings, such as a grocery store. Materials for the study include a computer or smartphone to view shared documents, a Google Doc to keep track of the steps, a camera or smartphone to take pictures or screenshots of the steps for IOA, and any step tracking device. Devices included an iPhone health app, a TomTom watch, a Fitbit, and a pedometer. After each session, participants recorded their amount of steps onto the shared Google Sheet. Participants had access to text messaging and email to share pictures or screenshots taken of their step data with a partner for IOA. Our behavior definition of walking is defined as bending and moving the legs in such a manner where a foot or shoe makes alternating contact with the floor or ground and the body travels forward, with or without the accompaniment of arms swaying forward and backward. For example, an individual stands and moves her legs so that her feet make alternating contact with the floor and propels her toward the door at a moderate pace. A non-example would be an individual standing, bending her legs, and propelling herself into the air. Her feet make contact with the floor at the same time upon landing. Jumping and walking in place, not including the use of a treadmill, are also non-examples.
Now we're going to talk about data collection. Each participant collected their steps during the first 6 hours of their day on a pedometer or smartwatch or phone app. These steps were then shared into an Excel spreadsheet each day. Further, screenshots of pedometer readings were sent to members at random to verify that the data was collected accurately. These accuracy checks, or IOA, were completed for 30% of sessions during each phase of the replication study. Additionally, accuracy in the increase of the step goal was measured for each participant to ensure the 10% increase was, in fact, accurate, and the goal the participant needed to meet. Both the original study and our replication used a multiple baseline across participants' design. All participants in both our replication and the original study entered baseline on the same day. Intervention 1 was introduced when baseline data were considered stable within 500 steps. And we also ensured that each participant entered intervention 1 on a different day to more closely replicate the study. This, as you'll see later, caused some members to have a long baseline phase and shorter intervention phases. On that note, let's hear more about baseline and intervention phases from Ashley.
Our replication had 4 phases, just as the original study did. During the baseline phase, participants either did not access the display for their current step count on their wearable pedometer, such as a Fitbit device, or closed their step tracking application on their mobile device. Specifically, one participant in the group utilized Health for iPhone during this replication. These actions kept participants from viewing the number of steps taken on the session days during the first 6 hours the group member was awake and active. At the end of the 6-hour session, participants recorded the number of steps taken in the designated Google Sheet and either removed their pedometer or closed their step tracking application. During the goal setting and reinforcement phase, each member determined an initial step count goal by finding the average number of steps taken during the baseline phase and adding 10%. If participants reached or exceeded their 6-hour goal, then a small and relatively inexpensive reinforcer was received at the end of the day. Some of the group's reinforcers included a piece of candy, a soda, applying a facial mask, and a self-pedicure. Goals were increased by 10% after the second consecutive session in the step count, where the step count goal was met or exceeded. However, goals remained the same and no reinforcer was provided when a participant failed to reach the goal. Participants also received a reinforcer at the end of the week if they recorded their goals and step counts in the shared Google Sheet for each session. The second baseline phase was identical to the initial baseline, with the exception that participants were allowed to view the display on their pedometer and keep their health application open, if they wanted, during the 6-hour session. Goals were not set and reinforcement was not provided during this phase. The second treatment phase was similar to the initial treatment phase. However, a daily goal of the highest step count recorded during the initial treatment phase was implemented for each participant. This goal was selected due to each participant demonstrating the ability to meet the goal. The step goal was not increased when a participant met or exceeded her goal for 2 consecutive sessions, but reinforcement was provided and withheld as in the initial treatment phase. Next, we will discuss our individual graphs displaying the data from our replication.
Here's an image of our combined multiple baseline graphs. Let's talk about each member's graph and their take on this replication individually. First, we're going to hear from Gina.
Gina, you're muted.
I was the first participant in the replication study, and I moved on to treatment after stable baseline data and set a goal that increased by 10% during the first intervention phase. My data had an increasing trend toward the end of the first intervention phase. I was able to reduce my steps. However, I didn't make it back to initial baseline during the second baseline phase. The second intervention phase was short-lived due to having to come to an end of the data collection on the final day of collection. I was sick and had not gotten proficient sleep, so in order to maintain or increase my intervention goals.
I was the second participant in the replication study to enter the first intervention phase after my baseline data was stable for several consecutive sessions. My data demonstrates a slight functional relation between the goal setting and reinforcement intervention and my steps within a 6-hour period. As you can see, during both intervention phases, I exceeded the established step goal and steadily increased my steps compared to baseline. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, I was unable to continue intervention for a long enough period to have my goals dramatically increase or to reach the terminal goal of 10,000 steps. Overall, I believe that this intervention worked well to increase my steps per day.
As you can see, my data was variable at the start of baseline and then became stable. The majority data during baseline was taken during my working hours, where my routine is somewhat sedentary. I was the third participant to enter the intervention phase after baseline data was stable for 5 days. I was able to reach the 10% average increase on day 4 in 5 of intervention. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, my second baseline was over the weekend when I'm most active, resulting in a slight decreasing trend entering the second treatment phase. Although there was a decrease, I was able to meet the second goal.
So as you can see here, it looks like I have a good amount of baseline data points that are relatively stable. This was due to us all staggering our start to intervention as the original study did, so it took longer for it to be my turn to start the intervention. In the first treatment phase, I either met or exceeded my daily goal, and then I returned back to baseline. The data doesn't really represent a functional relationship. This was also due to us choosing to take data on the weekend because of time constraints. The weekend fell on my second baseline phase, and I am much more active during the weekends than I am during the week. For return to treatment, you can see that I met one of my goals and did not meet the other for the 2 data days.
Like Jacqueline mentioned, the original study allowed for a longer period of time for each phase. My baseline data is pretty stable. However, each of us needed to begin intervention on a different day to more closely replicate the study. I met my first step goal criterion. However, when I increased that goal by 10%, I wasn't able to meet that goal. This was partly due to my schedule on those days. I had a lot of client cancellations, and I was sitting more often to write reports and reading for this class. So this is a limitation that will be discussed later in our presentation, but it's worth mentioning now. The students in the original study were given time at school to walk if they needed to increase their step count. However, being a working adult, a student, and a mother, it was really tricky for me to get my steps in for the day. Completing reading and assignments, as well as writing reports at work, was more motivating for me than the reinforcers that I chose. Additionally, adding step count days over the weekend was necessary, like mentioned before, so that each member could enter a return to baseline and intervention 2 phase. So taking data over the weekend wasn't part of the original study. And because I wasn't fully with it this day, I left my phone at home by accident. So that threw off my data as well, which is also reflected in my graph. So as you can see from my graph, this intervention did not have a functional relationship for me in increasing my step count.
So my graph is next. I was the last person to enter intervention, and I had a much longer baseline phase. And as you can see, my baseline is extremely variable. I like to run in the mornings before I go to work, which is why my steps were so high. But as you can see, like on days that I didn't run, my steps decreased dramatically. And due to time constraints, just like everyone said, I did have to start my intervention, even though my data does show an increasing trend before I started intervention. Then there were a lot of factors that did go into my steps, which I feel like that's why it was variable. Kind of either depending on what client I was with that morning. If I'm with a 2-year-old, I'm going to be running around more than I would be with a client who's 7 and we're working more at the table. During the study, though, I did feel that I was more motivated to wear my TomTom watch, but I wasn't as motivated to get my steps in. And this could have just been because my reinforcement wasn't strong enough, or that my schedule didn't permit me to have the time to choose to walk. Just like Monique said, that we are adults and we don't have that time where we can't have that opportunity just to walk. But as you can see, I did not make my goals in the second intervention phase. I came down with a cold, which got into pneumonia. So I was pretty much on the couch all day. So I didn't get any steps. But you can tell that I don't have a functional relation and that this intervention wasn't effective for me.
This table displays the averages and ranges for each participant across each phase.
Participants measured IOA by taking photographs or screenshots of the data yielded by her pedometer. That is, participants either took a picture of the display on the wearable pedometer or took a screenshot of Health's pedometer information. Participants were randomly paired and observed the number of steps documented in the photographs. The partner compared data entered into the Google Sheet with the data in the photographs. The results of this comparison were then submitted to the original participant, who calculated the IOA data. IOA was calculated using total count IOA, where the lower number of steps recorded was divided by the higher number of steps recorded. The number was then multiplied by 100 to obtain the percentage of IOA. Participants measured IOA for 30% of sessions throughout each phase. Results for inter-observer agreement data was at 100% across all phases for all participants. And here are two actual screenshots used by participants to compare data for IOA. To the left is iPhone's Health app, and to the right is the Fitbit app.
So now we're going to talk about treatment integrity. To report our treatment integrity, each group member recorded their step data in a shared Google Sheets log after the 6-hour session. This assisted in keeping each group member accountable for their step count and allowed each group member ownership of their own data. This also replicated the treatment integrity portion of the original study. Participants recorded their data in the Google Sheet daily and chose a reinforcer at the end of each session, if applicable. The group members also shared with other group members what reinforcement, if any, was consumed that day via text message, and also recorded the reinforcer on the Google document. Participants also calculated and entered their daily goal, which was reviewed with another participant to ensure the calculation was correct. Overall, most of the steps were recorded appropriately. The only error we encountered was when a participant broke her phone and step counter halfway through the session. To determine whether participants wore their pedometer devices throughout the session, each member of the group sent a photograph or screenshot of their daily steps for 30% of days when data was collected. The treatment integrity for 5 group members was 100%, and for 1 group member who broke her phone was 94%.
Up next, you'll see the slide on social validity. A social validity survey was conducted to indicate the effectiveness of the acceptability of using a pedometer to increase physical activity and measure satisfaction from participants in the goal setting and reinforcement intervention phase. According to Cooper, Heron, and Heward, 2007, social validity refers to the extent to which target behaviors are appropriate, intervention procedures are acceptable and important, and significant changes in target and collateral behaviors are produced. This survey was distributed to participants at the end of the replication study, imitating the original study. Participants were also asked identical questions from the original study. However, instead of a yes or no, we decided to go with a 7-point Likert scale that was used throughout the questionnaire, where 6 additional questions were presented to determine key components of the study and support the social validity for the graduate level participants, rather than just students with disabilities and teachers or facilitators. The participants in the replication responded to a total of 11 questions. Next, this slide is showing the actual social validity survey that was used. And in this survey, the participants expressed an overall positive experience during the replication of the original study. The questions from the article are for graduate level students that indicated that participants found the experiment to be a socially acceptable form of obtaining physical exercise with the use of a pedometer. And here is our combined results, again, for you to see. Our data is clearly represented in a multiple baseline across participants' design and includes embedded phase changes. Now let's discuss the results. So for our results and conclusion, the results indicate there is a variation in our data from the original study. Both sets of results, the original and our replication, are shown in a multiple baseline across participants' design. The graphs show baseline and goal setting and reinforcement. However, unlike the original study, our results do not show a distinct functional relation between the dependent variable, which is the number of steps, and the independent variable, which is intervention, or goal setting and reinforcement. 4 of the 6 participants' steps actually decreased during the first treatment phase, which was a limitation that Jacqueline will discuss next. Only 1 participant, which is Ashley, showed a slight functional relation between her independent variable and dependent variable. In short, the many limitations of the study could have an effect on the functional relation for the members of this replication study. The first intervention of goal setting and reinforcement provided an overall increase in the number of steps taken by all of the participants in the replication study. The IOA conducted, in addition to the group meetings, held all participants responsible for goal setting, despite that each participant was their own facilitator. Even though only one participant exceeded the terminal target goal, the other participants were beginning to gain momentum toward that target goal if the time constraints and other obligations, such as working a full-time job, having a family, attending graduate school full-time, were not a limitation. Then the conclusion could be made that all of the participants would have reached the target goal also. And as research from Normand in 2008 suggests, a relatively simple and low-cost intervention can be used to increase the physical activity of some adults. However, it can be concluded that the goal setting and reinforcement intervention worked to increase steps somewhat, but it did not make the same impact on graduate level adult students as it had in the original study with young adults diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder.
So our group discovered a considerable amount of limitations while in the process of replicating the original study. I put them into a table comparing the two studies to make it easier to understand. In the original study, the participants consisted of young adults, 3 males and 1 female, who attended a young adult educational program and were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Data was collected Monday through Friday from 8 o'clock a.m. to 2 o'clock p.m. Activities with the program were flexible and tailored to meet the students' needs. They were offered considerable amount of free time, and it was easy for the students to walk around school grounds during their day. Our replication consisted of 6 females without autism spectrum disorder in an online master's level education program across states and time zones. Many members of the group work full-time and spend much of the day sitting at a desk with infrequent access to breaks to walk or to exercise. Due to this, most participants in the current replication were unable to reach the original study's second intervention goal of 10,000 steps. Work schedules prevented the group from replicating the exact time frame for data collection. Because of this, each participant chose a 6-hour time slot starting from the time they woke up in the morning because of their varying schedules. Another variation from the original study involved the setting in which data was collected. While the original participants collected data during their school day, replication participants collected data in a variety of settings: working, driving, housework, coursework, running errands, spending time with family and friends, or caring for a family member, to name a few. It was the group's intention to only collect data on the weekdays, as the original study did. However, due to time constraints, we collected data on one weekend, which skewed and increased several participants' data. Another large limitation in replicating the original study was the varying types of pedometers that we used. In the original study, each participant used the same model of pedometer, the Zip wireless activity tracker by Fitbit. However, our replication group used a variety of pedometers, like many Fitbit models, Garmin watches, and the iPhone's health app. We identified an important limitation to the replication of the study towards the end of the project. The original study was carried out over a 42-day period, whereas we had approximately 20 days to complete all the phases of the study, and therefore many of our phases had fewer data points than was provided in the original study. Participants in the replication began reporting baseline data on the same day and started the intervention phases on different days. One participant had an increasing trend before transitioning into intervention due to these time constraints. In the original study, the participants used a black piece of electrical tape to cover the display on the pedometer to prevent young adults from reading the step count. But we felt that our replication had no need for the black electrical tape to cover the number of steps taken during baseline, and we all agreed to refrain from checking the steps on our devices. One participant within the replication group, who was tracking her steps on her phone, broke her phone during a session, as previously mentioned. Therefore, her data was not accurate for that session. And the last limitation we found was that the original study utilized facilitators, but in our application, we, the participants, acted as our own facilitators. So here are our references, and this concludes our project presentation. Thank you all for watching, and now we will open it up to our professor to see if there are any questions.
All right. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, nice job. That that is quite the study to pull off with 6 students to try to stagger a multiple baseline. And this is the first semester I'm doing in the summer. And so now I can see when you have an 8-week semester as opposed to 15, how challenging it can be to try to complete a multiple baseline. And one thing I just wanted to mention is that not only did you guys do a multiple baseline, but when you guys are writing the design up, you also did a multiple baseline with an embedded reversal design. So you did actually 2 designs, and that's what they did in the original study too. And so it's a combination, and it also takes more time because not only are you staggering intervention, but then with each participant, you're also returning back to baseline. And when you see that type of a design too, it's really it enhances your experimental control, because not only are you staggering the intervention to show that when it's implemented you see an increase in steps, but also when you withdraw it, that the behavior will go back down to baseline levels. But as you guys mentioned, for most of you guys, you don't really demonstrate a clear functional relationship. But one thing I really liked is how you guys described your sources of variability and what may have been factors that influenced your data. And one thing also that I think is a little bit hard is that because of the time constraints for this type of project, there were only 10% increments that were increased, correct, during the intervention phase?
That's
And how many days, and you probably said this, but how many days did you have to hit that 10% increase before it was increased another 10%? Did you have to do 2 consecutive days? Okay, that's what I thought. And so I think, unfortunately, it's just the increase is also just so gradual and small that you probably, with doing, and I love that you guys mentioned this, the intervention across 20 days instead of 42, it was going to really limit even how quickly you would have probably increased your steps because of how gradual the increments were. So some interventions, like you'll probably see, there'll probably be some other exercise intervention studies. The way in which goals are set really varies. And this would be one that really looks at like a slow but steady increase over time, which for you guys, you didn't have very much time. So it was going to limit how quickly you would be able to get to that 10,000 steps. One thing that I also think I mentioned in your graphs, and someone asked me this, was should we put the y-axis up to 10,000? And I think I said yes, because that would be the ultimate goal. But so many of you guys were so far from that it actually makes the graphs a little bit difficult to read. And it makes it a little bit harder to see even modest increases because your y-axis goes to such a high range. So what I would recommend is when you guys submit the paper is I don't remember, like, was anyone like a lot higher than anyone else, or
Yeah.
like was it all
I was.
You were? Okay.
Yeah, my
So
highest was 13,000.
okay, yeah, and you're the runner, right? You
Yeah.
were running before work and stuff. So one sort of big no-no typically is for you to have different y-axes for different participants in a multiple baseline, because it will sort of distort the data that you're looking at, and it can be a little bit hard to compare them when you do that. But in this particular instance, I would recommend that you guys probably vary your y-axes, because then it'll make it a little bit easier for somebody to compare the different phases, even if there were like small little changes. So for those who had 1,000 to, I would start at 0, but then for the individual participants, just go up to as high as you would need to be able to have all of your data showing. And then I think it'll make the graphs a little bit easier to see. And I have to remember that I said that, because generally I wouldn't say that, but I think for some of these, because you have such a range for the different participants, it would make sense, and it's just gonna it'll make the graphs a little bit larger. And then because you're going to see such small little changes with the 10% increments, it's going to make them a little bit easier to examine visually. And then I had one question about the literature review. I see that the studies are here in the reference section, but were you guys summarizing basically what several of these other studies had in common?
Yes.
Is that what? Okay. All right. So all of them were exercise interventions. And then you just went through like all the similarities between them, correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. All right. So just for any other groups too, sometimes it's helpful to have the actual citations in the literature review section, so you can kind of, and then you can kind of compare and contrast how the studies may have differed a little bit. But I just wanted to get a little bit of clarification on when you were doing that stage, it was just a combination of several studies that you were summarizing on that page.
Yes, in the paper I cited many of them, but then for the presentation, I just wanted to summarize to.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's fine. Let's see here. Let me ask. Oh, how many of you guys had a Fitbit versus a phone app?
I had a phone app.
I had a Fitbit.
Okay. I had a Garmin watch.
Yeah, I had a Garmin watch as well.
So I think it was Monique who might have mentioned that you forgot your phone in one place, right?
Yeah.
And so I really liked the table of you guys kind of listing what some of your limitations were. But whenever there are these exercise studies and groups use multiple different tracking devices, it's always important to mention that there may have been some variations. And I have found, and I don't know if you guys agree, that sometimes if you're relying on a phone application, you may be more likely to miss step counts, because so many people either don't carry it on them all the time, or they may forget it, or some of people can't even have access to their phone at work. And so it will really limit how much you're able to accomplish. But then other folks who have the steps that you'll be able to track, they'll say that if you're having a Fitbit or a Garmin, that sometimes you'll track steps and you're not actually walking. Like if you're talking with your hands or anything like that. And sometimes it will, so you guys had a beautiful definition of what your step was, but I've had other groups say too, like technically you're actually just measuring whatever movement is going to have you track a step on your specific counters. So did you guys find any of the applications to be like a little bit better than others? Or I know you guys talked about the variation, but anything else you can think of?
The way that the iPhone app tracks the steps was, for me personally, hard to cut it off at the 6 hour mark because it doesn't stop, or I can't like take a screenshot of it at that time, especially if I'm working. I don't have access to my phone during a session. So I had to actually click on the step count for that day and then add it all together for the 6 hour mark, because it like does it from 8:30 to 9, it has this many, and then like it goes up this way. So I had to calculate it that way instead of just like reading what the readout said. So that was something that I didn't really like about the health app for myself. It was a little bit tricky for me to track it that way. And also some of the blocks of time were like 5-minute intervals when some of the other ones were much longer. So I wasn't quite sure how iPhone decided how it was going to display that. So that was something that I wasn't quite fond of with the health app myself.
Okay. Anybody else?
Well, I can support Monique. I was her IOA partner. I can support her in the fact that the health app was not very friendly for counting all the steps accurately.
Yeah. Yes.
I have noticed that with my Garmin watch. I think sometimes if you drive slow enough, it, it thinks that you're walking or running or something. I didn't notice it during the time that we were collecting data, but when I wore it before, I would notice like, wow, I really have a lot of steps today, and I've just been in the car all day. So yeah, I don't know how accurate that is.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes some seem to be a little bit more accurate than others. And that's why I tend to ask that question to see if you've found some challenges when it comes to accurately tracking your steps.
Yes. Yes.
And, yeah.
It's also hard to rely on some, like especially for this project, we had to basically rely on our Fitbits or step counters. So there isn't much that you can do to like check if it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, I guess.
Oh yeah, no, you're right. And and the technology keeps getting better and better. And I think that a lot of times too, the phone apps are okay, but like if you just forget to put it in your pocket, then you're really stuck.
Yeah.
For some of those. Or if you have like you had limited access to it at work or something like that. So I've found that the phone apps, you tend to miss a little bit more of the steps than if it's something that you're actually wearing on you. But was there a 6-hour window in the original study, or how long was the length of time each day?
It was
it was
8 hours in the original study.
Yeah, 8 hours.
The length of the individual school day from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m.
2 p.m. Mm-hmm.
Got it. Okay, so now did you guys count that also as a limitation? Okay, yeah,
yes,
because
it's in there.
Okay, good. Yeah, because whenever you have a smaller window, it may be a little bit harder for you to count steps. A lot of groups too who do these intervention studies, they just keep an entire 24-hour time period. And so that gives you, and that makes more sense, actually. Now that I'm thinking of it, I'm like, wow, 10,000 steps. Some of them have like a pretty small number, but if you had been, and the recommendation is 10,000 in a day. So if you had been given a wider window, you may have been able to at least accumulate more steps during that time frame, and then you might have been closer to that ultimate goal of that 10,000. But I think when it comes to this study in particular, it makes it challenging if you're just going up by 10% increments when you have such a short duration of time. And so if you guys would have done anything differently, if you would have been able to change what the intervention was to increase step counts in terms of like how the goals were set, what ideas would you guys have had that you think it might have been a little bit more successful?
I think that it was a better time window.
Yes.
Like it goes from when we woke up till we went to bed, but then there would also be that limitation of when does everyone go to bed. So having like a 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. or having just a longer time window to get those steps in.
Mm-hmm.
Or also, I know that some people would have had time to walk or go on a run after they got home from work. But since we did it from when you woke up to 6 hours later, then that prevented some people from being able to do anything about increasing their steps.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially
yeah. Oh, I mentioned for myself that, I knew that I had to get outside and do steps, but also getting my assignments done was a little bit more motivating for me at the time. So I would have liked to, as Kyla said, I would have liked to have had a different time period to do it in. I think that I would have been more successful at meeting goals had I not just been able to have 6 hours. It would have been more functional for me if there was a longer time period.
Okay.
I think the small increases in goals were actually kind of frustrating for me personally. I think I would have been more motivated if the goals looked like they were giving me more progress. Because I did meet all of my goals because it was motivating enough for me, I guess. But I think that if we had gone maybe like 20% or 25% or something like that, maybe that would have been more motivating and we could have shown more progress.
I think that's a really good point, because I think you had such a small window of time to in the intervention phase that if the intervention had been successful, you probably would have demonstrated a functional relationship a little more clearly, because when you have such a small increment to increase and you have you're in the intervention phase, I don't know, 5 to 7 days or less, it's going to be, you're going to hit a ceiling basically, or you're going to be limited by how quickly. I mean, you can always go above and beyond, but that's the other thing with goal setting, is that you weren't pushed very hard. You didn't have to be. And in some of these other intervention studies, the participants actually set their own goals. And I think that some of them like that, because some of them will push themselves a little harder, but sometimes other folks will not push themselves very hard at all. So there's pros and cons to different ways in which the interventions are set. I think that it's always interesting to get people's feedback on if they had been able to change certain things about either the ways things were set or the way in which they conducted the studies. But overall, very nice job, very good presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed doing such a complex design in such a short period of time, because not only did you do the multiple baseline, but you also snuck in the reversal as well. So very well done on that. And I look forward to reading the discussion boards. Just make sure that you guys upload this by Monday of the week that the presentation is due, or the discussion board is due. Or is that the presentation that's due next week?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So just try to get that uploaded by Monday so people have enough time to do their 3 posts. And then for the people who did present for you guys, if you submit more than the required 3 posts, then you're eligible for up to 2 bonus points. So field as many questions you can from your peers. A lot of times that's what they'll do in the discussion boards. They'll ask some questions. So take advantage of that if you'd like.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah. You're very welcome. All right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.